I think we're going to begin now. We have 4 speakers this afternoon, and I think we're just going to begin. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure.
At the microphone.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Şener Aktürk, Assistant Professor at International Relations Department at Koç University in Istanbul. I know that you are tired, so am I. It is the latest panel of the day, but I'm going to provide what I take it to be the lessons of post-communism for the collapse of authoritarianism in the Middle East. So I'm not a specialist of Egypt, for example, or Tunisia, neither do I speak Arabic. I'm a specialist of Russia, post-communist states of Eastern Europe. Therefore, what I'm going to do here today, as the title of my presentation indicates, is to compare, to make the obvious comparison, right, between Eastern European revolutions of 1989 and the Arab Spring of 2011, because the last time we saw a serial collapse of authoritarian regimes in the world, one after the other, geographically and ideologically connected, was in Eastern Europe. Right? In the space of 1 year in 1989, communism collapsed in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania. People revolted against the same oppressive totalitarian regime, and later the revolt for democracy spread to Russia, the Baltics, and the rest of the Soviet Union. And today, we have a somewhat similar regional situation with the revolts in Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, Yemen, Bahrain, and elsewhere. We don't know how far. So what I'm going to do as a specialist of Eastern Europe, in particular Russia and post-communism, is to tell you what we learned 20 years later from Russia and the post-communist world about what brings democracy and what brings authoritarianism. We have a large enough set. There are 27 post-communist countries where communism was the dominant ideology only 21 years ago. And today, some of those 27 countries are extremely democratic. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Mongolia is a full democracy, right? But some of them, with a similar communist background, are among the most oppressive dictatorships in the world. Uzbekistan, Belarus, right? Turkmenistan, and so on and so forth. So what explains the variation? Why is it that some formerly communist countries became democracies, some couldn't? And what can we learn about the communist experience for democracy in the Middle East and North Africa, including maybe even Turkey, but of course Turkey is a multi-party democracy already. This is the map of the post-communist world. What you see here is that the darker color is non-free, right? These are the dictatorships: Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Russia, Azerbaijan, Belarus. The yellow is the partially free countries, semi-democracies: Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, Kyrgyzstan. And green are the democratic countries: Estonia, Latvia, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria. What we see in this Mongolia all the way to the east. What we see here is a vast variation. You have countries that were communist 20 years ago that are fully democratic, like Estonia and Poland and Mongolia, and that are fully authoritarian, like Uzbekistan. So how is it that some of them ended up with dictatorship again, even after the revolt against communism, and some of them didn't? And what this can tell us about Egypt and Tunisia and Syria today. The first lesson of post-communism is choose parliamentarism, not presidentialism, right? Tunisia, Egypt, maybe Syria, if the war ends, is going to go through a critical constitution-making process. Are they going to choose a presidential democratic system, like Philippines and Nigeria and the United States? Or are they going to choose a parliamentary system, like Germany and the United Kingdom and Italy and so on and so forth. None of the post-communist countries that chose presidentialism could democratize. Russia is the big presidential disappointment. Created a very strong presidency in its new constitution, like the Central Asian states, and it's one of the backsliders. Even countries that people didn't give a chance to, such as the poor Bulgaria and Mongolia, chose a strong parliament, designed a constitution that gave all the critical powers to the parliament and not to the executive, and they ended up, a country like Mongolia, with very low socioeconomic development, ended up being more democratic, far more democratic, not just from Russia, but from Ukraine, from Turkey, according to the Freedom House, right? So Bulgaria. So here I have a graph from the article of Stephen Fish in the Journal of Democracy, showing the correlation between parliamentary powers and democracy. Higher up is dictatorship, lower in the x-axis is democracy. Further to the right is the power of the parliament. Further to the left is a weak parliament. What we see is that countries with very strong parliaments, so all the way to the right side, Latvia, Mongolia, Romania, Bulgaria, also have the highest democracy scores, right? So there's a very clear correlation. Countries that have very weak parliaments, Kazakhstan, Belarus, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, in their constitution, countries that gave most of the powers to the president, are in the worst position, right? Dictatorships, having the lowest, in the Freedom House score, 7 is the worst dictatorship, and 1 is the most democratic state, right? So we have many countries in 6, 7, 5, and those are, without an exception, presidential regimes. Russia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, and so on and so forth. So the first important lesson, do not create a strong presidency. Either don't have a president or make the president ceremonial. Here is the, I'm not going to go through the survey of parliamentary powers, just to read a few of them, right? I'm going to read it from here. For example, can the legislature have effective powers of oversight over agencies of coercion, military, law enforcement, intelligence? Can the parliament, are the members of the legislature immune from arrest and criminal prosecution? Are members of the legislature able to initiate bills in every policy field, right? If you answer yes to all of these questions, and very few countries in the world have such strong parliaments, right? For example, there's a question that says, does the parliament need to approve the appointment of every minister, right? That's a very strong parliament, when the parliament has to vote for every single minister in the cabinet, right? Very few countries have it, but that means a very strong parliament. The point is, the stronger the parliament, the stronger the democracy. There are many problems with presidentialism. I'm just going to read out, I have written much of this, both in Turkish and English, over many years. Presidentialism creates recurrent gridlock. You'll have an elected president that has a different opinion than the parliament. You'll have a crisis of governance. It is a structural winner-take-all regime. Up to 49% of the population will not be represented because only one person gets to be elected president, unlike the parliament where you have, 400, 500 seats. The president can't be white and black at the same time. President can't be Coptic and Sunni and Shia at the same time, right? So giving a lot of power to one person is a recipe for polarization. Presidentialism weakens political parties. It is extremely difficult to remove an unpopular president. We saw this with George W. Bush in the United States. In his second term, his approval ratings were down to 10% or so when he was leaving office, but it was impossible to remove him. We saw it most horribly with Boris Yeltsin in Russia. He was an alcoholic, as you know, and he was incapacitated for much of his term in office, but it was almost impossible to remove Yeltsin from office because that's a problem of presidentialism. It personalizes politics. It makes corruption easier by creating a group of cronies around the president. It creates lower quality politicians whose primary function is to flatter the president and not to communicate with their constituencies. It creates subservient ministers to the president, and it's basically a recipe for creeping authoritarianism. I'm afraid if Tunisia or Egypt or Syria, if they create a strong presidency, that they will slide back to authoritarian politics in a few years. That was the most important lesson, of Russia and post-communist world for the Arab Spring. The second important lesson, of course, is that we should support political parties, not personalities. You cannot have a democracy without strong political parties. That's even a problem for Turkey, right? Very few parties here have 60, 70, 100-year-old history where people can register and grow up from the youth wing all the way to the top. But you can't have a democracy without established consolidated parties. Government by a political party, for example, Solidarity in Poland or the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, is much better than government by a popular president, even if this popular president appears to be pro-Western or democratic. Again, the lesson of Boris Yeltsin. He seemed extremely anti-communist and very democratic, but once in power, he gradually became an extremely corrupt, dictatorial person, lashing out to Chechnya, lashing out against opponents. So you might believe that person X, it can be Mursi, it can be Shafik, is an angel. He is a true Democrat at heart. But once you give him unlimited, almost unlimited power in the presidency, that is going to make him a very bad person probably in the long run. So avoid creating a strong presidency, create a strong parliament, right? No ideology, no party development. That's the other lesson. We want to build strong parties, but you can't have strong political parties without ideologies in uncertain democracies, because you need people on the ground organizing political parties, opening chapters in different cities, like working without the expectation of material gain even. That requires a lot of idealism. And idealism comes from ideologies. So it is okay and even preferable to have Islamist and liberal and communist and other ideological parties in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Syria, and elsewhere, because that's how you start off your political system. Stephen Hansen has an excellent book just a year ago comparing Third Republic France, Imperial Germany, and post-communist Russia. And he basically shows that what was very important for the consolidation of democracy in France was that ideological mass parties and the lack of clear ideologies on the democratic camp in Russia led to very weak party development and the coming to power of Putin. That the lack of clear ideological parties opposing, ideological democratic parties opposing Hitler was an important reason why Weimar Republic collapsed, right? So we need parties around ideologies. The fourth lesson, and this is very relevant to Egypt, I think, from the little I know, and it has been relevant to Turkey for sure, and it has been definitely relevant to post-communist Europe. Avoid the ethnic sectarian trap of authoritarianism. This is the lesson of Slobodan Milosevic, right? Very often authoritarian dictators, even if they are at heart communist, right, will change their ideology and they will say, now I'm a Serbian nationalist, now I'm a Democrat, just to stay in power, and they will target an ethnic, religious, sectarian minority to stay in power. They'll say, okay, fine, communism is collapsing, but let's kill Bosnian Muslims. Rally behind Slobodan, rally behind Milosevic, let's kill Muslims, and then try to rally some sort of national sentiment around the leader, right? I have been to many panels on Egypt, right? And several presenters have told me, and I might be wrong, right, that the military itself is provoking the Copts, attacking them, killing them, to create some sort of Coptic opposition and attack against the military so that it can tell the Egyptian people, rally around the military, defend authoritarianism because it is under attack by Coptic Christians. But this is the oldest trick in the Middle East, right? To provoke the population against a minority so that you can keep a military dictatorship in place. We had it in Turkey for a century, if not more, right? I don't want the same tragedy to delay Egypt for a century, right? And here we are very blessed to have so many scholars and intellectuals of the Arab world. This is a lesson of post-communism. It is a lesson of Turkey. Avoid the ethnic sectarian trap. Independent bourgeoisie is necessary. You like it or not, we need different business groups to fund different political parties and newspapers and journals, right? Because political parties do not function on the basis of voluntarism alone. You need logistics, you need a material base for political party competition. And a bad type of bourgeoisie is one that is extremely homogeneous and that owes its wealth to the state, right? If the Egyptian or the Tunisian or the Syrian state creates a bourgeoisie by handing out state assets to a group of cronies around the regime, that bourgeoisie is not going to ever oppose the regime because they owe their wealth to the regime. Right? So we need to have in the Middle East, in the post-communist world, in Turkey as well, a bourgeoisie that doesn't owe its wealth to the state, but that it owes its wealth to its own hard work and labor. And we need bourgeoisies that are diverse enough, ideologically and otherwise. Also, and then these are the last lessons, similarly, avoid an ethnic sectarian minority bourgeoisie, again a Russian lesson. What happened in Russia in 1990s? All of a sudden, and it is a coincidence, of course, that most of the Russian billionaires turned out to be Russian Jewish, Berezovsky, Gusinsky, Khodorkovsky, Abramovich. And what Putin could do is then to target the bourgeoisie by using popular nationalism and anti-Semitism to confiscate their property, to put them in jail, to drive them out of Russia. So the state could finish off the bourgeoisie because it was an ethnic religious minority. This is a big danger because if bourgeoisie is essential for democracy, you need to have a bourgeoisie that is not going to be easily wiped away by the state. So one way of doing that is to make sure it is not dependent on the state. The second way of doing that is to make sure wealth is not over-concentrated in a very small ethnic or religious minority, because that will make them easy targets by authoritarian dictators, whether it's Milosevic or Putin or Hosni Mubarak or Suharto and so on and so forth. Here I have heard a little bit about the Copts of Egypt again. I don't know Egypt, but you must avoid identifying one ethnic religious sectarian group with one political party and the bourgeoisie. That's very dangerous. Of course, how you can avoid that is a different question. Lesson 7, remove the authoritarian elite completely. In Russia, well, in Russia, you see this to a certain extent. Many nomenclatura. Who is Boris Yeltsin? He was the party chief of Sverdlovsk district. He was part of the Communist Party elite. People around him, most of them were high-ranking members of the Communist Party. Right? So they have, although they refashioned themselves as Democrats, and maybe they were Democrats for a moment, they kept the authoritarian structure intact. Who are the leaders of Central Asia today? Islam Kerimov. Who is Islam Kerimov? Chairman of the Communist Party of Uzbekistan 25 years ago. He is still the president of Uzbekistan. Who is Sapar Murad Niyazov, the so-called Turkmenbashi, the chairman of the Turkmen Communist Party? He has been in power until he finally died. I can give more examples, but you can look at the map and find out, right? You can't have democracy with the same people who implemented communism or Baathism. You have to purge the cadres that were instrumental in enforcing Baathism, communism, or other dictatorial regimes, whatever they may be, in order to build a democracy. Wherever you had a continuity of nomenclatura is what we call the Communist Party elite in Russia and the rest of Eastern Europe. If you have still the nomenclatura families, names, people in place, it's it's likely that it will slide back to authoritarianism. You can't build democracy with the same people who implemented communism. And the last lesson, and this is a very sobering one, of course, democracy does not create miracles. Right? Society has to be ready for a big disappointment. Democracy does not necessarily bring economic growth, wealth, or prosperity. Democracy does not bring more order, less crime, and less inequality. Democracy gives you the right to kick out the person who you don't like as your president and prime minister, but at the bottom of it, this is it. So it is unrealistic to expect that any of the Arab countries will suddenly record 15% annual economic growth because they transition to democracy. That has little to do with the regime. Right? Kazakhstan is growing exponentially. I'm sure some other authoritarian regimes are growing very fast economically. They are very authoritarian dictatorships. Being a dictatorship doesn't mean you won't grow, and being a democracy doesn't mean your country will be very prosperous. Mali was a consolidated democracy until a year ago. Mongolia is a consolidated democracy. Indonesia is a democracy. They are not very poor, they are not very wealthy countries. It simply means that people's voices are taken into account. As Amartya Sen pointed out, it means that people do not starve. That is a bottom line that democracy brings, because with free media and criticism from different political parties, state cannot tolerate millions of people dying in a famine, as it did in India before India transitioned to democracy, as it did in China when China was still when it still does in China under Mao Zedong. So clearly in a democracy, millions of people won't die from famine, but it doesn't mean they will be very rich. So, of course, I believe democracy is much better than no democracy, but it doesn't create economic miracles. So, to conclude, democracy has been in decline for at least half a decade. Many countries that were more democratic slid back to more authoritarian regimes. We had the Rose Revolution in Georgia and the reverse wave. We had a quasi-revolution in Kyrgyzstan, in Ukraine, and then a reverse wave of authoritarianism. Many countries that became democratic went back to being authoritarian. So this is not a good time for democracy in terms of the time in world history that we are living in. But will the Arab Spring result in democracy or simply replace one dictatorship by another? Will it create a demonstration effect and create a Central Asian Spring? Inshallah, we can say. But that's about it in terms of social sciences, I hope. But will Islam Karimov ever leave office, apart from certain biological death? We do not know. We do not see much of that happening. Seeing that half of the audience is Turkish, I put several of my op-eds from newspapers, Radikal, Sabah, and Zaman, summarizing some of what I said, especially the second one in Sabah, 2011 Egypt and 1989 Eastern European revolutions in 2011, and my views on presidentialism in Radical in 2007. You can catch up on those. With that, thank you very much for feedback and keeping in contact. You can email me at these addresses. Thank you.
Well, the presentation was very clear. I'll just try to briefly summarize what he had to say. He wanted to see what lessons the Arab Spring can draw from what happened in the Soviet bloc in 1989. He makes the analogy because before the Arab Spring, the last occasion when a series of governments across the region collapsed within a short time of each other was in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. And the question he poses is pretty straightforward. He says, if you look at the Soviet experience the Soviet bloc experience after 1989. Many of the countries emerged with strong democracies, but also many countries emerged with very repressive regimes. And so he tries to figure out what is the formula for not assuring, but making more likely that in the case of the Arab Spring, the governments that emerge will be similar to the democracies in Eastern Europe and not like the repressive regimes. And then he provides a kind of list of what you have to look for. I won't go through the whole list. The main focus, I think, was on the first point, where he says that it's much preferable, it's much better if the regime that comes to power is a parliamentary system and not a presidential system. The most famous of the parliamentary systems in the world is, of course, Great Britain, and the most famous of the presidential systems is the United States. And he says if you want to avoid the tendency towards dictatorship and you want to strengthen the tendency towards democracy, then you should choose parliamentarianism. Two things I wish he had explained a little more, and maybe time will allow during questions and answers, is why he thinks certain countries chose parliamentarianism and why certain countries chose presidentialism. That would give us more insight into whether it was the system that produced a good or bad regime, or was it the situation already, a repressive situation in one place and a democratic situation in another place, which produced good and bad regimes. That is to say, it's a kind of chicken and egg question. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? So which came first? Was it a bad situation that produced a bad regime, or was it a bad regime which produced a bad situation? Otherwise, there's a long list of other factors, and he closes on the note that even if you choose a democracy, that doesn't mean that your society is going to come out being much better than if you chose a dictatorship. So you can choose a democracy, but you might have more crime, you might have more inequality, and you might have, I forgot the third factor, crime, inequality, and
Lower growth.
And less growth. And of course, you have that paradox in many places in the world. So to just take some obvious examples, in 1948, there was relative equality in development between China and India, and it became a kind of competition. India was a prominent third world democracy, and China was a prominent not democracy. But most everybody agrees that the levels of growth, even during the years of Mao, were much faster in China than they were and continue to be in India. So you have to ask yourself, I guess, a last question, which maybe someone will ask him, namely, why should you prefer a democracy if under a dictatorship you might have less crime, more growth, and more equality. What is the reason why you would argue for more democracy? Why would you prefer it? Okay, so let's now turn to you. Just give me 1/2 second. You're going to be, I'm going to go to number 2. Can you tell him to try to speak slowly and not read his speech, because that's what they're having problems with. Because when he starts to read, they can't keep up.
Excuse me. The translator is asking us to speak slowly, not read directly.
Not read the speech.
Not read and speak slowly, they are saying.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. سيدي رئيس الجلسة، الجمع الكريم، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. عنوان البحث: تأثير السياسة، تأثير ثورة 25 يناير الحالي والمتوقع على الاقتصاد المصري. رمضان السيد أحمد معن، أستاذ مساعد بقسم الاقتصاد والمالية العامة، كلية التجارة، جامعة طنطا، جمهورية مصر العربية. على مدى عقدين من الزمن انتظر المصريون ثمارا للإصلاح الاقتصادي والسياسي، ولكنهم وجدوا في النهاية ارتفاعا في معدل البطالة وصل إلى 15%، ومعدل التضخم وصل إلى ما يقرب من 18%، ووصل ما يقرب من ربع السكان طبقا لمنظمات الدولية من 20 ل 30% من عدد السكان في مصر تحت خط الفقر، إلى جانب قلة الحريات السياسية واستمرار حالة الطوارئ وانتشار الفساد وعدم وجود انتخابات حرة نظيفة وانعدام حرية التعبير. كل هذا أدى إلى قيام ثورة 25 من يناير. ولقد تناولت الدراسة ثورة 25 يناير وتأثيرها الحالي والمتوقع على الاقتصاد المصري، ولتحقيق هدف الدراسة تم ذلك من خلال توصيف لحالة الاقتصاد المصري قبل الثورة والعوامل التي أدت إلى قيام ثورة 25 يناير وتأثيرها على أداء الاقتصاد المصري خلال الدراسة، مقارنة لوضع بعض المتغيرات الاقتصادية الكلية مثل معدل النمو الاقتصادي، معدل التضخم، معدل البطالة، الموازنة العامة للدولة، ميزان المدفوعات، الدين العام. كل هذه المتغيرات بنحاول نقارنها بين فترتين مختلفتين، قبل الثورة وبعد الثورة. تحديداً خلال 9 أشهر الأولى من عام 2012 والمناظر له في عام 2010-2011، والربع الثالث من عام 2011-2012 والمناظر له في عام 2010-2011. ولقد تم وضع رؤية لمستقبل الاقتصاد المصري من خلال سيناريو. هذا السيناريو متشائم يعتمد على استمرار الأوضاع الاقتصادية المتردية كما هي، وخاصة في فترة عدم التأكد. فترة عدم التأكد اللي هي الفترة اللي احنا بنعيشها دلوقتي من بعد الثورة إلى الآن. وسيناريو متفائل يعتمد على استراتيجية طويلة الأجل تستهدف وضع سياسات، تستهدف هذه السياسات معدل نمو سكاني قدره 1.5% ومعدل نمو اقتصادي قدره 8%. وتوصلت الدراسة إلى أن العامل الاقتصادي ليس هو السبب الوحيد فقط في قيام ثورة 25 يناير، إن لم يكن أهمها، فهناك عوامل اجتماعية وسياسية ساهمت في قيامها. كما توصلت الدراسة إلى أن النظرة المتشائمة هي نظرة تعتمد على الأجل القصير واستمرار حالة الانفلات الأمني والبلطجة والإضرابات وتوقف عجلة الإنتاج. أما النظرة المتفائلة فتعتمد على الأجل الطويل، وفيها يتم وضع سياسات تحقق معدل نمو سابقا قلت 8% وتصل بالاقتصاد إلى مرحلة الاستقرار. الفرض الرئيسي الذي يحاول البحث إثباته هو: هل التداعيات السلبية لثورة 25 يناير سوف تستمر في المستقبل؟ وما هي السياسات المستخدمة لجعلها إيجابية؟ ولهذا تم تقسيم هذا الفرض الرئيسي إلى فروض فرعية تتضمن التالي: أن ثورة 25 يناير لها تأثير سلبي على المتغيرات الاقتصاد محل الدراسة في الفترة الحالية فترة الأجل القصير. الفرض الثاني: من المتوقع أن يكون لثورة 25 يناير تأثير إيجابي على متغيرات الاقتصاد محل الدراسة في الأجل الطويل. الفرض الثالث: أن العامل الاقتصادي هو السبب الوحيد في قيام ثورة 25 يناير. خطة البحث: ينقسم الإطار العام للبحث إلى 3 مباحث إلى جانب المقدمة اللي بتضم المشكلة والهدف من البحث وأهميته وحدود البحث وفروضه والمنهج المستخدم. المبحث الأول من خلاله بحلل لواقع الاقتصاد المصري قبل ثورة 25 يناير. المبحث الثاني بحلل لواقع الاقتصاد المصري بعد ثورة 25 يناير. المبحث الثالث بعطي أو رؤية مستقبلية متوقعة لواقع الاقتصاد المصري بعد ثورة 25 يناير. واقع الاقتصاد المصري قبل الثورة كيف كان؟ في البداية لابد أن نؤكد على أن التشخيص السليم لأي مشكلة شرط ضروري ولازم ومهم للعلاج. عشان أقدر أعالج أي مشكلة لازم أحدد المشكلة تحديد سليم، وده اللي بيعاني منه الاقتصاد المصري. عدم التحديد السليم للمشكلة بيؤدي إلى تطبيق سياسات خاطئة وغير ملائمة، وبالتالي النتائج بتكون نتائج غير مرضية وغير مقبولة. عندما تم تحليل البيانات الخاصة بالاقتصاد من سنة 1974 ل 2011 وجدنا الاقتصاد المصري بيعاني من ظاهرة اسمها الركود التضخم stagflation، اللي هي تزامن ظاهرتي البطالة والتضخم. ناس مش لاقيين تشتغل، واللي مش لاقيين يشتغلوا عندهم رغبة وقدرة وقابلية ولكن لا يجدون فرصة عمل. ده بطالة إجبارية، بالإضافة إلى معدل التضخم اللي هو الارتفاع المستمر والمتزايد في المستوى العام للأسعار التي يؤدي بالتبعية إلى تدهور مستويات المعيشة، وده واضح قوي في حالة المجتمع المصري. الجراف أو الرسم بيوضح معدل الركود التضخمي خلال الفترة من 1974. يمكن أكثر تحليلي على فترة المقارنة الربع الثالث من 2011-2012 مع الربع الثالث من 2010-2011 والتسعة أشهر الأولى من 2010-2011 و2011-2012. لكن ظاهرة الركود التضخمي ظهرت مع 1974 مع انهيار منحنى فيليبس اللي كان بيأكد على أنه في علاقة عكسية بين معدل البطالة ومعدل التضخم. الأسعار لما ترتفع البطالة بتقل، لأن أنا صاحب مصنع أو صاحب منشأة لما أسعار المنتجات بتاعتي بتزيد بزود الطلب، بزود الإنتاج، بزود الطلب على العمالة. ده بيؤدي إلى انخفاض معدل البطالة والعكس. لما يقل الأسعار إنتاجي هيقل، أرباحي هتقل، طبعا إنتاجي هيقل، الطلب على العمالة هيقل، البطالة بتزيد. لكن بعد صدمة البترول الأولى والثانية وجدنا إن المنحنى بقى رأسي، وفي بعض الأحيان من الممكن يكون ذو علاقة طردية، الاثنين بيزيدوا مع بعض، وده أدى إلى تزامن البطالة مع التضخم. فأنا عامل التحليل من 1974 ل 2010-2011. ده الشكل بيوضح معدل التضخم في مصر خلال هذه الفترة. المشكلة لما بحلل الواقع الاقتصادي المصري مش ركود تضخمي بس، ولكن من الناحية الاقتصادية إن أي مشكلة بتغذي مشكلة أخرى. مرض بيجيب مرض. يقول لك بالظبط مسألة الفيدباك أو التغذية المرتجعة، إن نقول الدول الفقيرة فقيرة لأنها فقيرة، أو الدول الغنية غنية لأنها غنية، فالفقر بيؤدي إلى فقر والعكس. إذا دلوقتي أقدر أقول الفقر هو سبب ونتيجة في نفس الوقت. فأنا بقول دلوقتي الركود التضخمي أدى إلى ظهور مشاكل، مثلا أدى إلى انخفاض في النمو الاقتصادي. النمو الاقتصادي لما انخفض أدى إلى وجود عجز داخلي، عدم قدرة المدخرات الوطنية على تلبية احتياجات الاستثمار، فالدولة هتعمل على طول تمويل بالعجز. تمويل بالعجز فيؤدي إلى زيادة التضخم، هتقترض من الخارج هيؤدي إلى زيادة المديونية. إذن المديونية والتضخم هيضعف القطاع الخارجي، هيؤدي إلى انخفاض الصادرات. طبعا احنا عندنا التضخم حاجتين من الممكن يضعفوا الصادرات: تدهور سعر الصرف وارتفاع الأسعار في الداخل. لما الأسعار ترتفع الميزة التنافسية بتاع الاقتصاد بتقل، بدل ما المصري يشتري من جوه أو الوطني أو المحلي يشتري من جوه يشتري من بره، في نفس الوقت اللي بره بدل ما يشتري من جوه بدأ يشتري بردك من بره. إذن دلوقتي حصل بنسميه العجز التوأم، عجز في الموازنة العامة للدولة وعجز في ميزان التجاري أو ميزان المدفوعات. يبقى إذن المسألة مش مسألة ركود تضخمي فقط، ولكن الركود التضخمي غذى أو أدى إلى مشاكل أخرى، اللي هي مشكلة عجز الموازنة العامة للدولة ومشكلة عجز ميزان المدفوعات. أما نيجي نحلل لواقع الاقتصاد المصري بعد ثورة 25 يناير، هنشوف الأول إيه العوامل التي أدت إلى قيام هذه الثورة. الحقيقة ناس اتكلمت كتير، لكن هتكلم في عجالة. أول حاجة رقم واحد تردي الأوضاع الاجتماعية والاقتصادية للمواطنين. ده بيظهر من خلال مستويات الفقر المرتفعة والتفاوت الحاد والصارخ في توزيع الدخول، بمعنى غياب العدالة الاجتماعية. لا شك أنكم تتفقون معي أن الفقر والتفاوت في توزيع الدخول يعتبر من الموضوعات الهامة جدا جدا على الأجندة الدولية خلال 25 سنة الماضية. ويعتبر الفقر والخلل في توزيع الدخول من أهم العوامل الدافعة لقيام الثورات والاضطرابات. أيضا في مصر لم يكن هناك تأثير واضح للسياسات الاقتصادية على المواطن العادي. السياسات الاقتصادية كانت تخدم فئة معينة هي فئة الأثرياء، وكان مستوى معيشة المواطن العادي في تدهور مستمر، وده كان حافز ودافع لقيام ثورة 25 يناير. رقم 2 في تردي الأوضاع الاجتماعية والاقتصادية للمواطنين وجود فجوة بين التعليم وسوق العمل. في الحقيقة احنا عندنا في مصر، ودي مشكلة خطيرة، لا يوجد ارتباط بين سوق التعليم أو مخرجات التعليم وبين سوق العمل. المقررات لا تتفق مع مخرجات أو المقررات اللي بيدرسها الطالب، لا تتفق مع سوق العمل، وده بيؤدي إلى ظهور معدل مرتفع من البطالة بين شباب الخريجين. ولذلك في النظرة المتفائلة لابد أن نركز على التعليم كقاطرة للتنمية، وده هرصده إن شاء الله في الرؤية المستقبلية لواقع الاقتصاد المصري فيما بعد ثورة 25 يناير. أيضا سوق العمل المصري بيعاني من تمييز بين الجنسين في العمل، حيث تمثل مشاركة المرأة في سوق العمل من أدنى المعدلات في العالم، حيث الشابات ما بين 28 ل 29 تمثل 18.5% من قوة العمل المصرية، مقارنة بما يزيد عن 50% من الرجال. أيضا ارتفاع معدلات البطالة بكافة أنواعها، سواء كانت بطالة إجبارية، بطالة مقنعة، بطالة سافرة، كتير، بطالة احتكاكية، ولكن أنا بركز قوي على البطالة الإجبارية. أنا عايز أشتغل ومش لاقي أشتغل، فدي طبعا كان حافز أساسي لأن الناس تتحرك. أيضا ارتفاع المستوى العام للأسعار، وده بيظهر أثره في مستوى المعيشة وأنا اتكلمت عنه. زيادة عدد الاعتصامات والمطالبات الفئوية. نقطة خطيرة إلى جانب تردي الأوضاع المواطنين، انتشار الفساد. من العوامل الهامة جدا لقيام ثورة 25 يناير انتشار الفساد بأنواعه، سواء كان فساد سياسي، فساد إداري، فساد اقتصادي، فساد مالي، فساد تشريعي. يعني أنا عايز أقول بالنسبة الفساد السياسي بنسميه الفساد الكبير، وده بيحدث على مستوى القيادات العليا. أما الفساد الإداري فبيحدث على مستوى صغار الموظفين، ولذلك يقال أن الفساد السياسي عند صنع القرار، أما الفساد الإداري هو في تنفيذ القرار. اللي بيصنع القرار بيستخدم نفوذه في تحقيق مكاسب محددة أو معينة لنفسه أو لأشخاص بعينهم، وأيضا في نفس الوقت الموظفين البساط بياخدوا رشوة إلى آخره، وده موجود في البحث. عندي الفساد الاقتصادي هو التلاعب بالقوانين والأنظمة الحاكمة للنشاط الاقتصادي، مما يحقق مكاسب خاصة لشخص أو فئة من الأشخاص. ومن أهم صور الفساد الاقتصادي الاحتكارات الاقتصادية. احنا كان عندنا في مصر قبل الثورة فرد بيحتكر صناعة كاملة، وضع كان سيء، بيتحكم في السوق. ومن هنا أنا بدعو إن الدول ما تسيبش الأفراد إن هي تحتكر صناعات استراتيجية. لابد أن يكون للدولة دور، مهما وصلنا للخصخصة، فبرضك لابد أن يكون للدولة دور وتقدر تنافس. أيضا إلى جانب الفساد بأنواعه، الممارسات القمعية لجهاز الشرطة واستمرار حالة الطوارئ لمدة 30 عاما. وهكذا أستطيع أن أؤكد أن العامل الاقتصادي هو أحد العوامل المؤثرة والفاعلة التي كانت من وراء قيام ثورة 25 يناير، ولم يكن بطبيعة الحال هو العامل الوحيد، فإلى جانب ذلك هناك عوامل سياسية وعوامل اقتصادية. مكاسب ثورة 25 يناير كان شعار هذه الثورة: عيش، حرية، عدالة اجتماعية، كرامة إنسانية. تمثلت المطالب الرئيسية في إسقاط الرئيس وحل مجلسي الشعب والشورى وإنهاء حالة الطوارئ، ثم تشكيل حكومة انتقالية وطنية وبرلمان منتخب ومحاكمة فورية للمسؤولين عن قتل شهداء الثورة ومحاكمة عاجلة للفاسدين وسارقي ثروات الوطن. ما تم إنجازه: إسقاط الرئيس وكشف الفساد ومحاكمة الرئيس وأولاده ورموز النظام السابق، ووضع حد أدنى وأقصى للأجور وحرية التعبير وزيادة وعي المواطنين بحقوقهم. لكن هناك سلبيات للأسف. هذه السلبيات أعتقد إن شاء الله خلال الأجل القصير موجودة، ولكن في الأجل الطويل من الممكن تنتهي بإذن الله. طبعا السلبيات: الانفلات الأمني، انتشار البلطجة، استشهاد وإصابة العديد من المواطنين، كثرة المظاهرات والاضطرابات، الاعتصامات الفئوية، ارتفاع الأسعار، توقف عجلة الإنتاج، ظهور العديد من الائتلافات والانقسامات وعدم التوحد، وده أيضا والخطير انخفاض التصنيف الائتماني للعملة الصعبة في مصر. أثار الثورة على مؤشرات أداء النشاط الاقتصادي. طبعا النشاط الاقتصادي تأثر سلبا في أعقاب ثورة 25 يناير نتيجة لتراجع حجم الأعمال وتعطيل العديد من الأنشطة الاقتصادية. هناخد في عجالة لأن السيد الرئيس بيطلب إن أنا خلاص بسرعة استسمحه في 5 دقائق. النمو الاقتصادي في القطاعات الرئيسية للاقتصاد القومي حدث تراجع في معدل النمو الاقتصادي المصري في ال9 أشهر الأولى لعام 2011-2012 ليصل إلى 1.8 مقابل 2.3 خلال الفترة المناظرة من العام السابق، ثم ارتفع إلى 5.2 في الربع الثالث من عام 2011-2012 مقابل في نفس الفترة اللي هو الربع الثالث من 2010-2011 كان بالسالب، كان سالب 4.3%. لما نشوف طبعا معدل النمو، بتكلم على معدل النمو في القطاعات الرئيسية المكونة للاقتصاد المصري. هتكلم عن صناعة زي قطاع الصناعات التحويلية والاستخراجية. وجدنا إن حدث تعافي لقطاع الصناعات التحويلية والاستخراجية، وسجل القطاع نمواً قدره 5.8% بالمقارنة بالربع المقابل. الربع 2011-2012 سجل 5.8. في الربع المقابل ليه في العام الماضي كان مسجل سالب 11.4، وده دليل تفاؤل بالنسبة للاقتصاد المصري. بالنسبة لقطاع البترول، قطاع البترول لم يشهد في الربع الثالث من عامي المقارنة لم يشهد تغير كبير. يمكن 1.8 مليار حجم الاستثمارات في قطاع البترول في الربع الثالث من عام 2010-2011 هو نفسه 1.8 في الربع الثالث من 2011-2012. لكن في الربع الثالث 2009-2010
You're short on time. Can you communicate to him that we're short on time?
Yes. بالنسبة للاستثمارات في الكهرباء أيضا حدث تدهور في هذه الاستثمارات. بالنسبة للتشييد في مرحلة الثورة في الربع الثالث وجدنا حقق معدل نمو قدره سالب 9.1، لكن بدأ يتعافى وحقق 10.2. قطاع الإنترنت بدأ فيه خسائر موجودة فيه. قطاع قناة السويس محافظة على إيراداتها. بالنسبة للسياحة والطيران حدث دروب في الرحلات المنتظمة وغير المنتظمة بالنسبة لشركتي مصر الطيران وإكسبريس. بالنسبة للبورصة، البورصة دايما مرتبطة بالتقلبات السياسية والاستقرار الأمني وعدم وجود استقرار أمني، فلاقي معدلات المؤشرات بتتغير من فترة إلى أخرى، ولكن في الفترة الحالية بدأت تتعافى جميع المؤشرات الخاصة بالبورصة. البطالة، معدل البطالة زاد. بالنسبة للتضخم في الربع الثالث وصل للربع الثالث من عام 2010 كان 9.5، في الآن أصبح 11.8. بالنسبة للموازنة العامة للدولة، الموازنة العامة للدولة حققت عجز قدره 170 مليار جنيه، وده طبعا نتيجة لوجود زيادة في الأجور وزيادة في الدعم وانخفاض في الإيرادات الخاصة بالدولة. زاد العجز في ميزان المدفوعات من 6 مليار و19 إلى 7 مليار و93 الاحتياطات من 36 مليار إلى 28 مليار ثم 24، ودي حدود آمنة. الرؤية أخيرا الرؤية المستقبلية بالنسبة للاقتصاد، الرؤية المستقبلية بالنسبة للاقتصاد رؤية تعتمد على القصير وهي رؤية متشائمة، أما الرؤية المتفائلة فبتعتمد على مجموعة من المقومات. المقومات هي معالجة الفساد والتعليم وسياسة عاجلة للأجور. شكرا.
Because of reasons of time, I won't be able to summarize that talk, and I think we'll just go directly to you.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين. Sonraki çalışmam Arap Baharı'nda ihvan hareketinin rolü ve asker rejimlerle çatışması. Çalışmam ama adıyla belirttiği gibi Müslüman kardeşlerin rolü ve asker rejimlerle çatışmasıdır. Bu çalışma birkaç öğelere ayrılmaktadır. Müslüman kardeşlerin tanımı, ihvan hareketinin tarihçesi, kim Arap Baharı'nın devrimleri yaptı, Arap Baharı'nın devrimleri ve Müslüman kardeşlerin hareketi rolü, devrim sonrasında, devrim öncesinde, devrim sırasında, Mısır'da Müslüman kardeşlerin örnek olarak, Mısır'da mübarek çekilmesinden sonra Müslüman kardeşlerin hatası. Sonuncu oya çalışma sonucu. İhvan hareketi, İhvan Müslüm Yadayı'dır adıyla Müslüman kardeşleri teşkilatı sadece Arap dünyasında değil tüm İslam aleminde kendini hissettiren en güçlü fikir ve düşünce akımlarından biridir. Dünya çapında bir teşkilatı ağına sahip olan İhvan hareketinin bilhassa Orta Doğu ve Kuzey Afrika ülkelerinde büyük bir etkiliğini söz konusudur. Bu bağlamda Müslüman kardeşlerin siyasi ve sosyal tarihinin açısından başlangıçta çalışma konuşmaktadır. Ardında bu ülkelerde Müslüman Kardeşler Hareketi ve diktatörlük rejimleri arasında çatışmayı anlatmaktadır. Çalışma devrimlerin olaylarının merkezinde Müslüman kardeşlerin varlığı sunmaktadır. Zamanda resmi medya ve gazetelerde kaydedildiği haberler aracılığıyla bu varlığı izlemektedir. Çalışma devrimlerinden sonra geçiş aşamalarında Müslüman kardeşlerin siyasi manzara orta çıkması ve şeflerinde halk sarılmasını göstermektedir. Ve sonra bu ülkelerde Müslüman kardeşler parlamento ve cumhurbaşkanlığı seçimleri gitmeye sunmaktadır. Çalışma seçimlerinde kazandıktan sonra onlar ve derin devlet yani eski sistem kurumları arasında şimdiye kadar süregelen tartışmalara sunmaktadır. Çalışma ihvan hareketinin tarihçesi bu oyada kısaca şekilde Mısır'da ve diğer ülkelerde nasıl ihvan hareketi Mısır'da başladı, sonra diğer ülkelerde yayınladı. Ama Arap Baharı'nın devrimleri ve Müslüman Kardeşler Hareketi'nin rolü. Gerekli Arap devrimlerinin en önemli sonuçlarından biri İslami hareketler üzerindeki tartışmalara geri dönüşüdür. Hem bu devrimlerin tutuşabilmesinde rolü açısından hem de siyasi ve kinetik geleceği açısından. Özellikle son 20 yıl içinde bu hareketlerin uğradığı uzaklaştırma, dışlanma ve marjinalleşme dağlarının ışığında. İslam hareketler otokratik Arap rejimlerinin düşmesinden yararlanarak en önemli taraflarından biri olsa da gelecek birkaç yıl içinde demokratikleşme yolunda birkaç zorluklara karşı karşıya olacağını söyleyebiliriz. Yes. تمام. أقدر أعرب الشيلة إن عودة الجدل بشأن الحركات الإسلامية هي إحدى نتائج الثورات العربية الراهنة، سواء فيما يتعلق بدورها في إشعال هذه الثورات أو ما يتعلق بمستقبلها السياسي والحركي، خاصة في ظل دعاوى الإقصاء والتهميش والإبعاد التي تعرضت لها هذه الحركات خلال 20 عام الأخيرة. فمن الممكن أن نقول إن الحركات الإسلامية بالرغم من أنها من أهم الأطراف المستفيدة من سقوط الأنظمة الأوتقراطية العربية، إلا أنها ستكون في مواجهة صعوبات عديدة في طريق التحول الديمقراطي في الأعوام القادمة. ولو نظرنا بشكل موضوعي لوضع الحركات الإسلامية من ثورات الربيع العربي بشكل عام من أجل تحديد دور هذه الحركات وخاصة الإخوان المسلمين، لوجدنا أننا مضطرون لقراءة واعية للأحداث قبل وأثناء وبعد الثورات، ومن الضروري الوقوف على افتراضين أساسيين من أجل تحديد دور الإخوان المسلمين في الثورات. الفرض الأول أن الحركات الإسلامية لم يكن لها، يعني ليس بالمعنى القطعي، لم يكن لها الدور البارز في بداية إشعال الثورات، وذلك لأسباب عديدة، بعضها يتعلق بطريقة ومنهج هذه الحركات الذي يتجنب الصدام المباشر مع الأنظمة السلطوية خاصة في مصر أو تونس، وبعضها يتعلق بطبيعة اللحظة التاريخية والروح الثورية، والبعض الآخر يتعلق بقدرة هذه الحركات على التمسك والبقاء بشكل موحد دون التعرض لانقسامات داخلية. أما الفرضية الثانية أن الثورات العربية رغم أنها وفرت للحركات الإسلامية فرصة الحصول على الشرعية القانونية، فإنها أيضا وضعتها أمام مواجهة تحديات عديدة، أقلها العمل في بيئة منفتحة سياسيا وأيديولوجيا بدل من العمل في سرية طبقا لبنية تنظيمية معتمدة على التعبئة الفكرية والحركية. وهنا بهذه الفرضيتين يتعلق سؤال، هذا السؤال: من صنع الثورات العربية؟ بيد أن طرح هذا السؤال على هذا النحو ضروري من أجل توضيح طريقة وأسلوب ووزن حجم وفعالية كل قوة من هذه القوى السياسية والاجتماعية، ولكن بوجه عام يمكن القول بدون مبالغة أن المجتمع كوحدة سوسيولوجية تحليلية كان بمثابة الحاضنة الرئيسية للثورات العربية. ولو تحدثنا بعد ذلك عن الإخوان المسلمين داخل مصر، لوجدنا أن دورهم يتضح في هذه النقاط التالية. أولا، هناك بعض النقاط المحددة عن اشتراك الإخوان المسلمين في ثورات مصر، وذلك نظرا للدعاوي أو للحملات التي لقاها الإخوان المسلمون من تشهير بأنهم ليسوا مشاركون بالثورات. الحقيقة أنهم شاركوا بعد الثورات، لكن عند إشعال الثورة أو اشتعال فتيل الثورة لم يكن لهم الدور الواضح. فنرى أنهم قد شاركوا بعد بداية الثورة، يعني في المراحل التالية لبداية الثورات. وفي نهاية الحديث تقدم الدراسة خلاصة عن اشتراك الإخوان المسلمين في ثورات تونس، ثم في ثورات ليبيا، ثم في سوريا. وبهذا القدر أكتفي نظرا لتغيير اللغة الذي فرض علي أثناء المحادثة. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Okay, my name is Ömer Aslan. I'm doing PhD. I'm doing PhD in Political Science Department at Bilkent University in Ankara. And my topic today is A Century of Islam and Nationalism Nexus in the Middle East, a reassessment in the wake of the Arab awakening. What I'll do is, what I do in this paper, I look at how nationalists, Arab nationalists and Turkish nationalists, how they viewed Islam, how they interacted with Islam, how they confronted Islam, because they had to, and that's going to be one of my assumptions. First of all, like in response to Professor Steinbach, because yesterday he called what's happening in the Middle East a revolt. He said what happened in 1917, 1918 was the first Arab revolt, but that's not really true. Like there was no Arab revolt at that time. Because if you read, for example, Ephraim Karsh, who is pro-Israel and so on, and I don't like many of his views and so on, but still he sort of debunked this view about Arab revolt. There was no Arab revolt in 1917. What happened was, if you look at what happened, it was not the majority of Arabs that revolted against the Ottoman Empire. So you cannot, we should not see it as an Arab revolt. That's why I don't also view this one, what's happening, as an Arab revolt. And when we go past to the arguments of the paper, what I argue in this paper is that I caution against replacing the replacement model in nationalism versus Islam, this connection. And I'll tell you about what the replacement model is. And I conclude, the overall argument that I have in the paper is that nationalism always wins over Islam in different ways, though. And I'll talk about those ways. And I also invite, because yesterday again, Foreign Minister Davutoğlu and people like Professor Inat here, also he said he had a dream about the Middle East. And Professor Davutoğlu also talks about integration in the Middle East, regional integration, sort of coming together and so on, in terms of economic relations and political relations and so on. And I say, if that is to be done, if it's possible to do this, then we need to mollify, soften the national interests. And the concept of national interest is closely related to nationalism. So there is always a relationship between softening national interest, the concept, nationalism, then to make possible to pave the way for regional integration. And also we need to be aware of what is behind the concept Turkish Islam or Arab Islam, because I argue again in the paper that behind Turkish Islam or Arab Islam there is nationalism again. So that's, I think, the main argument, one of the most important arguments. So the replacement model is this. The nationalism literature, until I think very recently, the view in terms of the nexus between Islam and nationalism was that nationalism replaced Islam. So nationalism was a new secular religion which sort of put behind Islam as people's attachment. But this view has been recently challenged by Laya Greenfeld, I didn't give her name, but an American scholar. She expressed this view, the replacement model, in the most eloquent way. She says, for example, most nationalisms that we may readily call religious today imply no such religious seriousness. What she's saying is that nationalism replaced religion, and that's the replacement model. But recently, the new sort of search is for the modes of different relationship between Islam and nationalism. Rather than saying Islam, nationalism replaced Islam, they look for certain different modes of relationship. They say, for example, Islamic nationalism. They might say that, or they might try to find out how Islam wasn't rejected by nationalism, but was somehow accommodated by nationalism. And what I do is exactly defend the replacement model. I say nationalism replaced religion, and Islam in this case, in my cases, and I caution against replacing the replacement model too, like in other words. And those people like Anthony Smith, for example, ethno-symbolicists, and Rogers Brubaker, and even Sami Zubaydah, they try to find out different modes of relationship between Islam and nationalism, so they reject the replacement model. They instead look for module or modular nexus between religion and nationalism. And what I do, try to see Turkish nationalism and Arab nationalism, what Turkish nationalists and Arab nationalists, what they thought about it. Like, did they really like accommodate Islam? Did they, for example, argue for Islamic nationalism, and were they successful, and so on? And through them, I try to show that, like by looking at Turkish nationalism and Arab nationalism, I argue that actually replacement model was correct, I think. That's my argument. And the one problem that is always, like, I think, common to those studies, like nationalism studies, like I do, like history of thought, you pick out certain nationalists and you try to look at them. Otherwise, like if you want to look at every single person who called themselves nationalists and who were influential, obviously, then like the limits of paper would make this impossible. So you have to pick certain nationalists and you leave some other people out. And if you know, obviously, like that, if you can tell me like I left someone out and who is important and who may challenge like my argument, then there will be good feedback. So I begin with Yusuf Akçura, and like, I'll go over them like quickly. Yusuf Akçura is one of the most like early Turkish nationalists and Russian like immigrant to Turkey. He accepts Islam, but he says, I accept Islam as a nationalist as long as Islam is reformed and Islam gets itself adapted to nationalism. So it's not like Islam per se, but Islam should reform itself along the lines of Christianity so that I will accept Islam as a sort of cement of nationalism, Turkish nation. And Ahmet Agayev is somewhat different from Yusuf Akçura, but he then accepts Islam as Turk's national religion. So somehow like he argues for a Turkish Islam, sort of. So we see, I think, the first beginnings of this idea of Turkish Islam in Ahmet Agayev. And Ziya Gökalp, like, he discussed the need for translating the Quran, making Turkish the language of the Azan, and the Islamic call for prayer. And he also argued for making Turkish the khutbahs and so on. He saw Islam important, but Islam wasn't the like cement. Language was a cement of the Turkish nation. Again, Islam is somehow sidelined. Or if Islam is accepted, only like by Turkifying certain aspects of Islam, then they accept it. Like there's always like a reforming sort of parts. But he didn't argue for Turkifying the language of the prayer. So in prayer, people would pray again in Arabic, like read from the Quran and so on. But apart from that, like in khutbahs and so on, the language of the prayer, the azan, then those would be in Turkish. And he refers to Abu Hanifa to legitimize this and so on. Like I can answer your questions if you have. And with the inception of the Republic, some of Gökalp's suggestions were heeded, like they were taken into account. And we know efforts, for example, to etatize like state religion, sort of like with the Directorate of Religious Affairs, and to Turkify religion again, like certain aspects of Islam. For example, Turkish translations of Quran were solicited. Language of the Azan and Hutbas were changed to Turkish from 1932. So the real objective of these efforts during the Republic, the official, in the official language, the real objective of these efforts was again building a Turkish nation, not giving the nation a religious cause to unite like behind or around. So the idea was again like we can't discard religion, Islam, but Islam wasn't the basic like founding elements of the Turkish nation. Language and history were the founding elements. Of course, like when you look at during the official Republic, when you look at one stream, like the official level, that doesn't mean there are no other people who talk about like this relationship between Islam and nationalism. For example, we have the racist, the Turanist école, and the Nihalatsız basic, like the spokesman, the epitome of this, the école. And the Nihalatsız, like there is no, like, he didn't see Islam as important. He's asked, for example, on one occasion what he thinks about Islam, and he says, for example, I accept Islam because like my people, Turkish people, they believe in it. If they believed in like horses, then that I would accept as well. Because that doesn't, so religion, whatever the religion is, I don't care. Like, it can be anything. So that again, in him too, we don't see Islam at all. But Islam seemingly comes back, makes a comeback in 1960s, and that is the beginnings of the Turkish Islamic synthesis, which I'm sure that you have heard about like many times. But so and this period, like with the Turkish Islamic synthesis, people say like Turkish nationalism was Islamized. So Islam came back to Turkish nationalism, to Islamized nationalism. But I argue that's not the case. So if you look at, for example, the major proponents of Turkish Islamic synthesis, the spokesman, look at, for example, Ibrahim Kafesoglu, an historian, and Muharrem Ergin, you read their books and so on, which I did, read their books, what they said about Islam and nationalism. Their Islam is not like, Islam is always, is not, again, not this basic cement. For example, Çetin Say says about them, and I disagree with this. And the Aydınlar Ocağı is like the heart of the Enlightenment is being founded in 1970, 1969, and so on. And Aydınlar Ocağı, the heart of the Enlightenment, is also related to this Turkish Islamic synthesis. About them, Çetin Say says, the intellectuals' heart's understanding of religion, they follow the line put forth by Gökalp. Islam is the essence of the national culture for them. But I disagree, basically, with this. Again, I have to go fast. Sayyid Ahmet Arvasi is basically the one in nationalist intellectual I know best, probably. And his conception is kind of different. He doesn't say Turkish Islamic synthesis, but he says Turkish Islamic ideal, Türk İslam ülküsü, which is now like very common, very prevalent. And he had a like big influence on Turkish nationalism. And you read like what he said about, and he was a like sincere Muslim, like observing prayers and like all that, and so on. But then when the Islam that he takes is again like, you would most probably disagree with what he's saying. For example, he will say Türk İslam ülküsü, but then he would be against Turkish people marrying Arab people or non-Turkish people. Like anyone, even if they're Muslims, non-Turkish, he is against marriage of that sort. Or he would like, in certain aspects, he is different from Turkish Islamic synthesis, but in terms of Islam's role in Turkish nationalism, he's not that different. So what we see in Turkish nationalism, if you take those people like along these lines, actually nationalism sort of seems to be taking Islam inside with Turkish Islamic synthesis, but it's not really accommodating Islam. It's nationalism wins. And like what for example, Sayyid Ahmet Arvasi would be really critical of the practice of Islam, understanding of Islam in Libya, in Iraq, in Syria, in Egypt. He thinks Turkish people understand Islam best. And no other Muslim people, they don't understand Islam at all. He'll be very critical of Sayyid Qutb, Ibn Taymiyyah, and so on. Like he would like deride them basically, say like he was pretty angry with them. So with this Turkish Islam, he is again like under this Turkish Islam, there's again nationalism. It's not Islam, but it's an Islam that is sort of parochialized. So the universal nature of Islam is being parochialized, localized to make it Arab Islam or Turkish Islam, and then nationalism underpins. And just go like over Arab nationalism again. So you look at like Sati al-Husri, for example, the Syrian, and he lived like in the late Ottoman Empire and so on, but then he settled in Syria. You look at like Mishalaf, like a Christian in Syria, but then like today we know Lebanon. You look at what they taught. For example, Sati al-Husri, like for him, Islam was kind of a threat to the Arab nation, because Islam was kind of demanding. Islam had a political aspect, and that was like he thought would put the formation of the Arab nation at risk. So he thought like Islam, we can take it, but not its political aspects. Then we look at, for example, Michel Aflaq. Then we look at like Michel Aflaq. He took the Prophet Muhammad as a like Arab genius, the product of the genius of the Arab people. Again, like eviscerating the like sort of devoiding the content of Islam. And finally, we look at, for example, Abdul-Rahman al-Bazzaz and so on. What they do is then come up with an Arab Islam. Instead of Turkish Islam, then we see an Arab Islam. And if you look at Taha Hussein, he saw Egypt's destiny in Europe and so on. But let me just... And again, like there is big changes. When I was surprised when I first heard the concept Al-Umma al-Arabiya. And I thought like ummah, like how do you use this with Arabs? Like ummah is like this ummah. And it includes Turks and Algerians and every people. But then you say al-ummah al-Arabiya, what is this? And this concept, the ummah concept, has gone through a big transformation. And Talal Asad says this, like the Arab nationalists, they use this ummah, but ummah is like not the ummah we know, so it's different. So again, we see like the nationalists, they use, even when they take Islamic concepts like ummah, they nationalize it. And then Islam, so Islam is like not really like there anymore. And I guess I'll finish it here. But like the main argument was that nationalism replaces Islam, not the vice versa, not otherwise.
Okay, I see hands up. Maybe first of all, I can ask you, how much time do we have? How much? I hear 5, 10, 15. So I'm going to let her decide because I think you're here to decide. So 15 minutes? Okay. So 15 minutes, I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 hands up. Let's try to do those 7, and we'll keep each of them to 2 minutes. Let's start with you.
Ben son konuşmamıza, siz milletçilikten bahsettiniz ya, burada Orta Doğu'da Araplar, Orta Doğu bölgesinde Araplar, Yahudiler, Türkler, Kürtler mesela etnik olarak bunlar Avrupa Birliği gibi bir bölgede entegrasyon altında yaşayabilirler. Böyle etnik milletçilik, İslamcılığı öne sürmeden böyle ekonomik alanlarda barış içinde yaşama daha ön planda onun olması gerekmez mi milletçilik yerine? Yani böyle milletçiliğe gerek var mı daha doğrusu?
Okay. We take all questions and answer, right? Or should I answer?
I think what we'll do is I'm going to ask you to first try to get all 4 panelists. So who has a question for the first panelist? Good, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
الآن بسؤال السينر أكتورك وتكلم take your time وأعطى النموذج البرلماني على كمقياس للديمقراطية. نود أن يحدثنا عن ما حدث في بلجيكا، هي نظام برلماني لكنهم لم يستطيعوا تشكيل حكومة لأكثر من سنة، فهل يكفي أن يكون هناك نظام برلماني حتى يشتغل أما هناك عوامل أخرى؟ كذلك سؤال بالنسبة للعلاقة بين الفقر والديمقراطية. هناك متحدث قال بأن الفقر هو سبب الثورة في مصر، فماذا عن الهند؟ الهند من أكبر الدول الديمقراطية منذ خروج البريطانيين، ومع ذلك ظلت ديمقراطية مع أنها كانت من أكثر البلدان فقرا. فهل الفقر يؤدي إلى الثورة؟ لماذا لم يؤدي إلى الثورة في الهند؟ ولماذا كان النظام الديمقراطي مستقر؟ ثم أنا أحب كذلك أن أقول أنني أنا أتفق مع أكتورك فيما يخص النظام الديمقراطي. هو الهدف ليست التنمية، وإنما هدف هو الحرية، كما نحن تعلمنا هذا من عند حنا أرنت. من مآخذ حنا أرنت على الثورة الفرنسية أنها حاولت أن تعطي مضامين اجتماعية للثورة الفرنسية، فبذلك فشلت الثورة الفرنسية. وأظن أن الحرية لا تحتاج إلى مبرر ولا تحتاج إلى مكافأة، هي في حد ذاتها مكافأة. وشكرا.
My question is for Professor Aktürk as well. It's a bit connected to the question that Professor Finkelstein raised. I'm just wondering, you showed very clearly that the Central Asian states are upon the most authoritarian systems. I wonder if there is a connection to the way they gained their independence, because as far as I know, there are basically 2 ways how the countries of the former Soviet Union gained their independence. The one was fighting for it, like, for example, the East European countries, Poland or the Czech Republic. And the other was like the Central Asian states. They were kind of released into independence because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So do you see there a connection?
Okay, who would have questions for the person on the Egyptian economy? Well, I'm going to ask a question. I wonder if you can just clearly state what do you think are the main challenges facing the Egyptian government now in terms of the economy, and what are the prospects that they will be able to solve the main challenges? A question for the person who spoke on the history of the Brotherhood. Okay, then I'm going to, okay, good, go ahead. No, the person on the Brotherhood. Okay, so I'm going to ask the question to you. There's some feeling by some people that the Brotherhood stole the victory that was not created by it, that other people made the revolution, and then the Muslim Brotherhood stole the revolution away from those who made the revolution. So I wonder if you can respond to that criticism of the Brotherhood, that during the actual revolution, they were nowhere to be seen, and then when Mubarak was overthrown, then they basically stole the victory from those who made the revolution. So that would be my question to you. And now questions to this person. Yes.
Hocam benim size sormak istediğim soru, bu saydığınız Yusuf Aktürk, Ziya Gökalp'lerin yanısında Mehmet Akif Ersoy'u bunlarda nereye koyuyorsunuz?
I would just like to make a comment, because when you chose the two Arab writers that you chose at the end, which are Saad al-Husari and Michel Aflaq, I don't know if you...
Two more, but I couldn't show them.
Okay, the fact is that those two are among the most fascist and I would say Nazi-prone writers in this time. So I don't know if they are the best examples to speak about nationalism against religion. Just a comment like that. Like, I don't know which the other two writers are, but I think they are not the best example for this.
Oh, there's, okay, let her go.
Benim de sorum Ömer Hoca'ya olacak. Türk milliyetçiliği İslamlaştırılmış diye bir kelime kullandınız ve Ziya Gökalp ve birkaç kişiyi daha örnek vererek ezanın Türkçe okutulması vesaire şeylerden bahsettiniz. Zaten laik bir ülke olduğumuz için hani din ve devlet işleri birbirinden ayrı olduğunu düşünüyorum. Ve ezanın Türkçe okutulduğunda daha da bir milli olacağımızı düşünmüyorum. Zaten bir milliyetçi bir ülkeyiz. Hani bunu doğru bulmadığımı, bir de yani Hazreti Muhammed, yani İslamiyet Müslümanları Arap'tan ayırmayı da doğru bulmuyorum. Çünkü Hazreti Muhammed peygamberimiz de bir Arap olduğu için oradan geliyoruz. Suni bir ayrım yapabiliriz ama bu konudaki ayrımı nasıl yaptığınızı merak ediyorum. Bir de nasıl denir? Yani asıl sorum hani laik bir ülke olarak hani bu aşamada söylediklerinizde ezanın Türkçe okutulması veya yani bunların Türkçe yapılmasındaki asıl amaç ne? Çünkü hani bazı şeyler Türkçe'ye Arapçadan çevrilemiyor ve çok fazla yanlışlıklar olduğu için ben bunu doğru bulmuyorum. Bunun milliyetçilik açısından ne anlatmak istediğinizi tam olarak bu yüzden anlayamadım. Benim sorum bu yani.
Well, the time is up for interpreters, so I'm not sure what I'll do at this point.
Respond to one in English.
Okay,
They won't
I think we should go to the
I want to
answers
ask-
right now. Let's start on this way and just work our way down. So go ahead. And we'll
Okay.
work this way.
Their times
I know,
up
I
and
know.
they are going to.
I know.
Should say bye bye.
Translators are not here.
5 minutes. Answer.
Türkçe soranlara ben Türkçe şey yaparım falan ama nasıl?
I think we'll start here and just come down.
tamam.
Yeah, I know.
Can we
وما كانش فيه مترجم ساعتها. Ben konuşma.
Evet, Türkçe dinleyen var. Devam ediyoruz.
Yok sen şey okuyorsun ya. Okudun anlamıyor.
evet.
أنا بس لو
Biz anlıyoruz da onlar tam anlamıyor o yüzden şey yapıyorum.
دكتور حمدي أنا عايز أجاوب بس على سؤال بسرعة كده.
We have a 10 minutes.
Okay. So let's try to move quickly. I'm going to ask each person here to take 2.5 minutes. Look at your watch. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
أوكي.
بالنسبة لسرقة الثورة أو أن الإخوان سرقوا الثورة، يعني هذا كلام نعده مغلوط إلى حد ما. فالإخوان هم الذين مهدوا أو وضعوا المناخ، يعني هم الذين يعني خصبوا الأرض لقيام الثورة، وذلك من خلال القنوات ومن خلال الندوات ومن خلال كل شيء. ولكن عدم إشعالهم لفتيل الثورة هذا الذي حسب عليهم، وذلك كان ذكاء منهم. كان ذكاء منهم أن لا يشعلوا فتيل الثورة، لأنهم في هذه اللحظة لو هم الذين بدأوا أشعلوا فتيل الثورة لكانت الثورة قد وئدت قبل أن تولد. لأن هناك خلاف ونظام قمعي وأشياء كثيرة جدا يمكن أن يصطدموا بها، فهم تركوا قوات المجتمع المدني تقوم بالثورة أو تشعل الفتيل، ولكن كان لهم الدور الأعظم في حماية الثورة، فهم الذين حموا الميدان وهم الذين نظموه وهم الذين دعموه. هذا بالإضافة إلى أن نجد أمثلة مثل محمد البلتاجي يوم 22 يصرح بذلك قبل قيام الثورة نفسها، وكذلك نجد أن عصام العريان المتحدث الرسمي باسم الثورة يحشد في خلال ساعة واحدة 160,000 وذلك قبل قيام الثورة. إذن فهذا كلام مغلوط أنهم سرقوا الثورة، بل بالعكس بما يدل على أنهم هم أصحاب الثورة أو قيادة الثورة، يعني موقعة الجمل التي حدثت هم الذين تصدوا للبلطجية أو يعني بالمفهوم أو باللغة التركية شتلر، هم الذين تصدوا لهم. فهم إذن من قاموا بالثورة، يعني ليس من قام بالثورة أن إشعال الفتيل تركوه للقوات المدنية، أما من قام بحماية الثورة وتنظيمها وكافة الأدوار والانتخابات كان هم الأخوة المسلمون. وشكرا.
Yes.
Should I respond in English, Turkish?
Okay.
English.
Okay. I'll first respond in English to the question that she asked. So the question you asked, like, they might be fascist or they might be like pro-Nazi, but that doesn't matter. Like Michel Aflaq, Şener mentioned the, like Baathism, and if he's influential along those lines in Baathism, this ideology, which was hopefully still ruling ideology in Syria. Maybe it has been changed, but it doesn't mean that they are not like influential. But of course, like there might be other like nationals that you should take and look at and so on. Anyway, okay, sorry.
Yes.
Şimdi Mehmet Akif Ersoy'a gelince Mehmet Akif Ersoy'un tabii İstiklal Marşı'nda ırk şeyini kullanması tabii o ayrı bir şey. Yani orada bayağı bir tartışmalar dönüyor. Ama ondan öncesinde mesela Sırat-ı Müstakim diye bir çok önemli bir dergi var. Osmanlı'nın son zamanlarında o dergide dönen tartışmalara baktığınız zaman mesela Mehmet Akif Ersoy, Babanzade Ahmet Naim'le beraber mesela milliyetçiliğe karşı şey yapıyor yani. Karşı tartışmaları var orada. O şeyleri önemli. Yani o milliyetçi sonuçta şeye de geldi. Cevap veriyor bu biraz. Mesela Kur'an'ın tercümesi konusunda Mehmet Akif Ersoy görevlendiriliyor mesela. Kur'an-ı Kerim'in tercümesi ona veriliyor. Hitabeti de çok iyi olduğu için. Ama onun mesela şüpheleri var. Yani tercüme etsem mi etmesem mi diye. Yani tercümenin zor olduğu mutlaka o şeyi var. Daha sonra hatta tercümenin yanlış yöne çekilebileceğini düşünerek bir kısmının yaktırılmasını istiyor ki hatta gündemi takip ediyorsunuz. Biraz tartışma dönüyor o şeyde. O anlamda. O ayrımı da hani ben yapmıyorum aslında. Yani burada bahsettiğimiz ya Gökalp falan vesaire ama o ayrım hani milliyetçiler genelde yapıyor. İslam'da milliyetçiliği ya da hani Arap İslamı ya Türk İslam'da onlar bahsediyor. Ben aslında o şeye karşıyım yani. Hani Türk İslamı demek ya da Arap İslamı demek. Ben onun hala mesela çok yaygın bizim halkımızda da yaygın. Bence Araplar arasında da bayağı yaygın. O bence şeyi hala onda milliyetçiliğin izi var yani. Arap İslam'ında diyeyim öyle bitireyim yani başka şey yok herhalde. Ha, sizin sorunuz da yani milliyetçilik gerekli mi değil mi? Bence gerekli değil ama hani gereklilik meselesi değil olay. Hani milliyetçiler varsa ve onlar gerekli görüp o konuda bahsediyorlarsa, yazıyorlarsa, bunda yaygınsa hani bence de gerekli değil ama olay hani gerekli değil falan meselesi değil yani. Ondan çok başka bir olay. Ben de katılıyorum size de hani gerekli değil bu demekle bitmiyor yani sonuçta o şeyler hani o bayağı bir şey konu. Hani gerekli değil ya da gerekli meselesi değil olay. Onu diyeyim. Barış için bence de gerekli değil.
Thank you very much. Does it work? Okay. Can you hear me? This one is on?
This one's fine.
Okay, it is a scandal, right? I mean, we have to say that. I mean, it is a scandal, but I'll do what I can. And clearly, you are not, and nobody here is responsible for the scandal, but it is a scandal nonetheless. In 2 minutes, I'm going to tell what I can in relation to what you have asked, starting with the poverty question that came both from you and from the audience. Why should you prefer democracy if it doesn't bring more equality, more wealth, less crime? And your poverty question was related to that. Well, dictatorship doesn't bring more equality, more wealth, less crime either necessarily. We have horrible dictatorships from Congo, Kinshasa to Brazil, previously Namibia, South Africa, apartheid. So at the very least, if you have a democracy, you have a chance as a citizen to deliberate and criticize that inequality, crime, and less growth and produce solutions to it. And as Amartya Sen and others said, democracy at least prevents the worst outcome. At the very least, you won't have a massive famine where millions of people will die. That one, maybe you won't be affluent, but at least you won't have cultural revolution tragedy as in Maoist China. So in that sense, democracy is preferable. Your second question, why certain, actually that was your question, why some countries choose parliamentarism and not presidentialism, the chicken and egg question. Interestingly, I think because we are talking about revolutions, these are moments of opportunity. It's not Saddam Hussein writing the constitution, somebody just overthrew him. Very often they give the job of writing the constitution as a technical job to political scientists, lawyers, and so on and so forth. So they have enormous, especially on the technical issues, they have an enormous opportunity. Nobody is going to pressure them on whether the parliament should have its own resources to run its operation, you know, very details of parliamentary powers. And if you are that political scientist or legal expert writing the constitution of Poland or Czech Republic, you can decide its fate. Best natural experiment is Bulgaria and Russia. Bulgaria was emerging from a horrible dictatorship as well. They gave the job of writing the constitution to people who thought parliamentarism, the European model, is better. They wrote a very Westminster-type British constitution. And Bulgaria, a poorer country with worse ethnic problems and a horrible record of democracy prior, ended up much, much better than Russia, which had larger, you know, resources in every level, intellectual, economic, and otherwise. So it matters. I don't know who is writing the Egyptian constitution, but if I knew them, I would tell them, you know, look, data is here. We have data for 200 countries, right? A powerful parliament. Central Asian states, absolutely, but we have examples of countries, Belarus, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, Georgia. All of them initially overthrew their dictatorships. They did have a revolution. They brought pro-democratic leaders, Kravchuk in Ukraine, Ebulfez Elchibey in Azerbaijan, Shushkevich in Belarus, and I forgot the Georgian guy. But then nomenclatura struck back and communist leaders were restored. Aliyev is a KGB chief, the father of the current Aliyev. Right? Pure Politburo, pure nomenclatura. The current leader of Ukraine is nomenclatura. Lukashenko is pure nomenclatura, communist leader. So they came back, and they have presidential systems. So there is some correlation, yes. For Central Asia, yes, but many Middle Eastern countries were also released into independence, and now they are overthrowing their dictatorships. So my thesis, I think, swims, even if they are released into... I can't get to Belgium. I don't want to run out, because we ran out of time. I can't talk to you in person about Belgium. Okay.
بالنسبة للسؤال هل يمكن أن تتعايش الديانات المختلفة في الشرق الأوسط كما في أوروبا؟ في الواقع هذا ما يتم في مصر. هناك أسلوب المواطنة حيث يعيش المسلم والمسيحي واليهودي بدون أي مشاكل. سؤال آخر بالنسبة للحكومة والمشاكل الاقتصادية اللي بتواجهها في الفترة الحالية وإيه الحلول؟ طبعا المشكلة الاقتصادية دلوقتي الحكومة المصرية بتعاني من مشاكل كثيرة، توقف الإنتاج وتعطله والوقفات الاحتجاجية والعجز في الموازنة العامة للدولة وميزان المدفوعات. الحلول في الحقيقة في الأجل القصير لابد أن احنا نرشد الإنفاق، وترشيد الإنفاق هيأتي من ترشيد الدعم، لأن الدعم في الحقيقة في مصر بيمثل 146 مليار جنيه بنسبة 27% من إجمالي المصروفات أو إجمالي الإنفاق الموجود في الموازنة العامة للدولة. وأيضا لازم نركز على موضوع ترشيد دعم الطاقة في مصر، ولازم نجد ليه حلول، لأن طبعا الدعم في مصر لا يصل إلى مستحقيه. وجميع الحكومات اللي جت حاولت تخش هذا الملف ولكن فشلت فيه، لأن طبعا ملف لحد ما شائك، لكن إن شاء الله في الفترة القادمة إن شاء الله هيبقى حلول واضحة إن شاء الله. بالنسبة لسؤال فيما يخص الفقر والديمقراطية، طبعا في ارتباط وثيق بين الاثنين. فالديمقراطية بتؤدي إلى مشاركة جميع فئات المجتمع في تحديد مصائرهم، وبالتالي مش هيبقى فيه ديكتاتورية ومش هيبقى فيه استغلال للنفوذ لتحقيق مصالح خاصة. إذن أقدر أقول في ارتباط وثيق بين الفقر والديمقراطية. شكرا.
Okay, thank you. I have to give you your certificate, Professor Elmas. Okay.
That's yours.
Oh, that's, I already received it. Aktürk?
That's me.
That's you, thank you. Ahmed?
Thank you.
Maybe a mistake. Okay. Thank you.